So excited for this conversation. So we've been chatting for, I'd say, years now about all the different changes in the recruiting industry, all the different challenges with different kind of challenges that recruiters are facing on a day-to-day basis, and the way that the economy is changing. And after our last conversation, we decided to just have another one, but live on air, and see if we get any questions from the audience and just get some instant feedback, and maybe just share some of the thoughts. But I'm really excited to have you here, especially given your background. And so for anyone that doesn't know you, Kellogg MBA, straight into Bain, you spent some time in executive search before taking on the leadership role of the TA team at Farmers Business Network, late stage, high growth company. Really kind of hiring a lot, and that's where we met, where you were one of the first pilot customers for what I've been trying to build with Sonar. So eternally grateful for the early support there, but even more grateful that you're taking some time to chat through about what you see changing in the recruiting market and the future of recruiting. So I'm going to hand off to you, and it would be good to get from your perspective a quick background on where you are, where you've been, where you're going, and then we'll kind of jump into the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm excited to chat as well. And even I was thinking as we went through the pilot when I was at FBN of working with Sonar, I think that's a good example of just how much the recruiting industry is changing, how much new technology and new ideas are coming into the market, and something that you and I have been talking about now for, I think, the better part of the last 2 years. And I think that is only going to accelerate. But we'll certainly get into that. Mm-hmm. My quick background: I'm not a lifelong recruiter, HR professional. Kind of grew up within a business, as you mentioned, did the consulting thing, and then executive search and leadership assessments, and then before going kind of back into a company to lead recruiting and aspects of learning and development. And I'm very proud of having that diversity of experience. And I think it has helped me be a more thoughtful recruiting leader and just people leader that ideally transcends the HR function. And I think and hope we're going to see a whole lot more of that. And I think that's something else we'll talk about, of how people in the recruiting space are evolving and will, I think, need to continue to evolve just to be successful and help companies grow. So that's quick high level background.
So that's exciting. I'm actually very interested to get into that discussion. But I thought a good place for us to start would be actually looking at what the market for recruiters is like right now. And you've kind of been on the other side of the table now. Yeah. And how's it been? What are you seeing? What's different in 2023 that wasn't around a year or two ago?
Yeah, so I lived all sides of the spectrum. 15, 16 months ago, when I was growing and scaling my team, you almost couldn't find a recruiter, especially a tech recruiter. The great ones were really, really hard to find, and the ones that you could find were really, really expensive. You could almost write your own ticket. Fast forward a year after that, and it was the opposite side of the coin, where if you're someone in the recruiting space, the tech space, the startup space, which happened to be the nexus of my universe at the time, your LinkedIn feed is just filled with people who are unfortunately losing their jobs, companies having more and more layoffs, and tech and early stage hit the hardest. And it's been tough for this year. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty at the evolution of the economy, and like, are we going to go into a recession? Are we going to hit the debt ceiling? And I see more and more companies just kind of pause. Like, there are those that are doing layoffs, but also those that maybe when money was essentially free or a year plus ago, would have hired that extra recruiter, and now just kind of waiting. So it's tough in the recruiting space right now, and my team and even myself subject to role eliminations that were the right thing to do for the company given what's going on in the market. And I mean, that's one thing about this function. It's extremely cyclical, and anyone who is in this function or thinking about going into the function, you need to understand that and be comfortable with the fact that there are high highs and sometimes there are low lows, just depending on what's happening in the broader market. And it's a trough right now that certainly has Some areas of positivity, especially when you look a little bit like outside of tech, if that's the space that you've been immersed in, there's plenty of things in non-tech that are growing. There are plenty of still startups that are being funded. So it's not just kind of doom and gloom everywhere, but it's tougher than it was a year and a half ago. And that's just the reality of where we're at today.
Yeah, it almost feels like recruiting is like there's an on-off switch for recruiting, and you're either kind of going full guns blazing, or you're doing zero, and there's kind of no in between. And unfortunately, many recruiters have been impacted. But fast forward 3, 6 months, maybe 12 months, when everyone starts to recruit again, all of a sudden there's going to be a huge demand.
Yep.
From what I've seen, there seems to be a lot of people moving out of the tech industry. And actually trying recruiting roles in other domains, or even moving out of recruiting altogether. And kind of you mentioned your background and how you had come into recruiting with a business lens. Curious to know from your perspective, what do you think that brings to the recruiting function? Like, what are the blind spots that you have, but what are the strengths that you think if someone's considering taking a move into a non-recruiting role right now, what would their life and their career prospects be like on the other side?
Yeah, well, I think first it's helpful to talk about the HR function as a whole, where I think historically the HR function operated somewhat, if not wholly, transactionally in a lot of places for a long period of time. It's a function that needed to exist for the purpose of hiring and firing and all of the people related. And there are still, unfortunately, many companies that I think operate that way. But the companies that have taken a look at the HR function, and instead of thinking of it as a just necessary function that has to exist within a company, but instead as a function that, like any other function, can be a strategic aspect to and a lever to drive the business forward through the people lens. I think there are more and more companies going in that direction, and there are more and more people immersed within the HR function who are not just someone who's had, promotion upon promotion within HR and look at things through that more siloed lens, but people who have experience in an operational role, and people who have come from other functions and have just more of a, like, how are we going to drive this P&L, or how are we going to take the strategies that the company is trying to achieve that keep the company afloat, and use kind of people to drive that forward, which is very different than so I think it's more proactive. It's very different than, like, we've been given things that we need to execute because that just has to happen within this company. Like hiring being one of the best examples. Like, we've been asked to hire 100 people, and now we're going to kind of put this process in place, and we're going to hire those people. So that's how I've seen the HR function evolve. And then I think recruiting is a microcosm of that, where your historic traditional recruiter might have been more of a project manager almost, of like, I'm receiving the inbound applications, I am, filtering through some of those and giving the ones that rise to the surface to the hiring manager and facilitating a process, but being a little bit more passive in that. And there's still many companies and many recruiters that operate that way. They're certainly dwindling in the percentage that I think operate that way, and there will be fewer and fewer going forward. So to get back to the heart of your question, I think if you are a recruiter who is either staying in the field or wanting to come into the field, there certainly are project management aspects of recruiting that will continue to be important, but I think dwindling importance as time goes forward. What will differentiate someone in this space is the fact that they are a strategic advisor and relationship builder, relationships internally and externally. And it's not enough just to kind of have a good rapport with a hiring manager or a candidate, but you're going to need to be someone who takes a look at, like, what are we trying to achieve from a business standpoint? How does this potential hire do that? And then giving advice and recommendations along the way to do it, and sharing, like, hey, I think someone with this type of background that might not, using the HR or recruiting example, might not be fully siloed, but hey, here's someone who's done this other thing, this other function, and how they might supplement this role that you're considering hiring manager, and giving advice like that to candidates as well. So I think the best of the best recruiters today do that. They're willing to have an opinion, to assert a point of view, and to disagree, and to have very candid conversations to co-create jobs, to share what they're seeing in the market and saying like, hey, I think we need to tweak this role or this approach because of what I'm seeing. There absolutely will need to be more and more of that. And if that gets folks excited, I think that then recruiting is a good world to be in going forward. If it is more of the like, I enjoy a process and I enjoy pushing a process forward, I think there will be less of that, and there should be less of that in recruiting as time goes forward.
Yeah, and so I would agree. I think we're starting to see now this bifurcation of roles in recruiting, where we have this kind of traditional recruiting role where it's what we used to call coin-operated recruiters, where you give someone more recs than they can handle, and they just go and execute. And I think what we're seeing now is as the volume of hiring is not quite as steep, and the focus is a lot more on the quality of hire. Recruiters who are able to bring that point of view and bring that perspective on what the market actually looks like, and a coach to hiring managers to help them make better hiring decisions, actually leads to better quality candidates and better quality hires ultimately, which means stronger performance in the business, and so that kind of consultant approach of actually being a talent partner rather than a recruiter is not just kind of good for the business, but it actually lifts the whole HR department to become a net value add to the organization, as opposed to what many historically have perceived as a cost center and kind of just and something that you need to have in order to do business.
I really like the phrase cost center, because I think that is yes, recruiting is a cost center, but when it continues to evolve in this direction that we're talking about, it will still be a cost center, but to the degree we can measure it, it is going to reduce the load of that cost center, because you decrease attrition, because you bring in individuals who then kind of prop up and drive the P&L forward in ways that are difficult to completely measure back to recruiting. But instead of considering it as a cost center, I consider it as a strategic lever to drive the business forward. Just as like corporate development is a strategic function to drive a business forward with the goal of driving a P&L. Recruiting can and should achieve the same goal, just through the talent lens. And I think if there is a strong recruiting function, it will start to bleed into things like, what are the competencies that we've developed within a company? How do those dovetail into performance enablement? How are we taking those and making those as part of role descriptions and evaluations? And then how are we screening candidates against those to assess that? Which just requires a lot more proactive strategic guidance and review as time goes forward. And a lot more kind of veering out of your lane, which kind of goes back to the theme of someone who has purely lived in a very like structured, process-driven recruiting world. The need for that will, I think, narrow more and more as time goes on. And those who have broadened and have exposure to different things, whether it's within the people function or outside, I think will become that much more dangerous in their roles.
So it's almost like the kind of craft of recruiting is evolving now with that demand. And we talked about quality of hire becoming kind of one of the key metrics that a lot of companies are highlighting, as opposed to volume or speed. What else do you think's driving that? So we're seeing this kind of probably increased demand for more strategic, consultative recruiters. What else is on the horizon or already here that you think is kind of pushing that need to be less process oriented and more kind of innovative, more strategic, more analytical?
Yeah, I mean, technology is a huge aspect of this, where like you and I have talked about a couple times. We now have this fun thing called AI, and even a fun example, like you leveraged AI to help kind of draft a bio, because I didn't have an updated bio, and like that's something that probably saved you, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes than if you had to kind of construct it all yourself. Anything that can be algorithmized, if that's a verb, will be, I think, through AI. And there are plenty of aspects of recruiting that are more of an algorithm. And if you think of a lot of what a sourcer does, and like leveraging Boolean, and like the best sourcers right now will kind of create an algorithm to then go and scan, whether it's an internal CRM tool or LinkedIn or something else, to try to match like what they put into their algorithm with what exists out there. AI can do that. And as AI gets more and more sophisticated, I think it's going to have a huge impact on top of funnel as it relates to recruiting. And it's going to, I think, it's going to start with the topmost end of the funnel of like, here's your hundreds of people. And as time goes better and as it gets more sophisticated, it's going to work its way further down the funnel. And that's where the importance, I think, that a recruiter plays will be, well, anything that cannot be put into an algorithm, like that's where you're going to create more and more value. So as technology increases, as AI gets more into recruiting, I do think it will shift the need of where people need to spend more of their time, because just like it took you less time to draft a bio, it's going to take an organization less time to get to the same point in sourcing because of technology that can assist in that. That just is one kind of anecdote, I think, of how things will evolve.
Yeah, it's actually one of the more controversial theses that I've presented in some of the LinkedIn content I've created is this kind of changing of a recruiter's role away from this more like project manager and more towards one of two roles, either someone who manages the AI tools and really has to understand how they work and the biases behind them, and what they can do, what they can't do. And then the other side, what we've discussed, that consultative recruiter who is actually bringing their experience and their value and the kind of things that can't be replicated by an algorithm yet to the organization, and really being that talent partner. How do you feel about that change in the needs? Had you already seen that in your role at FBN? Is this something that's still on the horizon, or is it already here?
It is here, and it will continue to grow. So I'll go back to, I first got into the HR-ish realm when I went into executive search, and the most tenured partners who had been doing that for decades upon decades. There actually was one partner who did not even use a computer, like literally did not have a computer, like had a Rolodex and just called people, and was very successful in his business of just calling people and quite literally leveraging no technology outside of a phone. Then fast forward in kind of what existed from a talent acquisition standpoint at FBN, where, first we have our applicant tracking system, and then we went and we kind of brought in GEM, and we were getting more sophisticated with leveraging A/B testing and how we reach out to people, and how we are cataloging those who we reach out to, and how we are being more efficient about having automated follow-ups with individuals. And that's just in a couple-year window of what I observed in executive search and being immersed in a talent function internally within a company, not quite apples to apples, but just using that as an anecdote. Going forward, to your point around, like, you need to be more adept than kind of just speaking with candidates, than just managing a process. And you might not have to be a computer scientist that can like code like GEM or kind of create an ATS, but leveraging that technology to drive your job forward and make you that much more efficient, that has to happen. And if it's not going to happen, it's going to limit, I think, the scope of impact that any one individual can have within the recruiting function, because there's going to be so much more asked of your average recruiter today than there was last year, than there was 5 years ago.
Exactly. And I brought up a concept a while back of the 10x recruiter or the 100x recruiter. Of like, what would it take to have to empower an individual recruiter to do the job of 10 of their peers? And it feels like a year ago there was still all kind of make believe, but now we talked a bit about ChatGPT and AI and the ability to generate things very, very quickly. Automation, even with a CRM like GEM, where now you're not having one-to-one communications over email that an individual recruiter will have to manage, but they can actually manage a whole talent pipeline and whole engagement strategy. Where do you think that's going? Obviously, with more access to more roles, if we take a lens from the candidate's perspective now, how do you stand out from the noise when all of a sudden the kind of the Venn diagram of all the different companies that are engaging with candidates starts to overlap with a much broader strategy? What are you seeing there?
Yeah, so I I don't think it's, ask me again in 2 years, maybe I'll change my mind. But as of right now, I don't think it's feasible to 10x the output like of a recruiter. Now, I'll also give the famous consulting answer. It depends on what we are recruiting for. If we are recruiting for truck drivers across several geographies that require like very little human interaction to kind of, and very little like relationship building, relationship management, things that are more kind of transactional roles, sure. I think there will be through technology the ability to 2, 3, 4, 5x whatever it is, the output from a recruiter. But if we're talking about roles that are more strategic roles, a little bit squishier, that don't have super clearly defined job descriptions, so I think that's something that also is a trend evolving, where jobs are getting more complex and less. Like a CFO is not a CFO, for example. And there, I do think it is absolutely possible for a recruiter to 10x the impact of what they're doing. So I look at it more as the multiplier effect of the impact you are having on the company and on the business, not so much on the output, especially for the non-transactional roles. And for that to happen, I think you have to be someone who is, the same themes that we talked about, a relationship builder. You have to have a point of view. You have to leverage your intuition and understanding of the company and understanding of the market to build bridges and match make and to guide hiring managers along the way. And if you're doing that, I think you can, leveraging the technology of kind of what you're getting in top of funnel and knowing how to take that and appropriately, efficiently kind of whittle that down to get to better answers, and then making those decisions and recommendations, that I think absolutely can be a 10x impact. But that's, I think of it more in that vein than I do output. And I see output happening more at the front, it's the top of the funnel, and impact happening more of kind of what has come through the funnel and then what is going into the business.
Yeah, I think I would definitely agree with that approach of there are certain things that humans do far better than machines, and freeing up recruiters to focus on those things and forget about the things that humans don't do very well, like process management and automated routines, can really help to leverage. And I think that's where this talk about efficiency, but it's really adding value. Like, how can you maximize the value that one individual is adding? And the C-suite, that's becoming more and more important as headcount becomes more constrained moving forward.
And it's, I think everyone needs to wear kind of an HRBP hat, and that way become more and more important from a recruiter as well, where as they've built relationships with hiring managers and understand what's going on within the function, they can then start to triangulate and understand, like, well, hey, wait a minute, I think we have an issue with kind of this thing going on. And if we bring in a person in the role that we've kind of defined it as of now, like this might be a headwind, or even seeing things like, hey, like this person who we brought in is struggling with X, Y, or Z, and that person might need some sort of feedback that they haven't received thus far. And it's those types of things from being on the ground, immersed within the team and the organization, that AI is not, at least right now, going to be able to make like those types of recommendations and have that type of impact. But that's, I think, where the modern recruiter needs to really insert themselves, and that's where they're going to add the most differentiated value.
Yeah, I actually had a conversation just this week with a leader at a startup, and we were talking about the kind of the value of the recruiting organization and how they can best be leveraged. And he made a really great point about how when you have a good internal recruiting partner that really understands the business and really understands your requirements and your need and has gone through those repetitions with you, they can actually bring so much more valuable and save a significant amount of time in the recruit process compared to more of a transactional approach. And you kind of put numbers behind that hypothesis, and it really does bring a ton of extra value. I think right now that's not really being measured as far as I know in many organizations. As the recruiting output is, did you make the hire or not? What's your time to fill? What was the cost per hire? How do you think that's going to change moving forward, and what can recruiters do to actually lead and drive that change?
Well, let me kind of start at the end with, I think my ideal like future state is if you are observing a hiring manager and a recruiter and you just get like a snippet of a conversation of them for 1 minute with no additional context, that you don't necessarily know who the recruiter is or who the hiring manager is, because they both are talking about the business. They both are talking about strategies of like, well, how do we keep this candidate engaged? Like, what are the right types of ways to assess this person? So I think it's, and something not new is, everyone's a recruiter within a company, and bringing on top talent is everyone's role and one of their most important ones. And I would say the same thing for the recruiter. Like, everyone is a business manager and a business leader, and understanding how a role and a candidate going into a role can have an impact on the P&L and the business. So I think that's the desired future state. How do you get there? I think and this is something that, we started doing more and more of in recent months when we had the gift of a little bit more time, when it wasn't as much recruiting hair on fire. But you have to immerse yourself in the business. You have to ask a lot of questions of like, starting with like, what are we trying to achieve? Like, what are the top 3, 4, 5 goals this entire year? Like, what are we looking to do from a numbers standpoint? I think you have to understand the financials. You have to understand the strategic priorities. And if those are not already known and those haven't already been presented, you got to go and immerse yourself with the people who are immersed in that, and you got to find it out. And that, I think, is the go-do for a recruiter. And yes, it takes extra time, but it's going to make you that much better at your job, and it's going to, I think, 10x the impact. I like the phrase "go slow to go fast," and if you, as a recruiter, take your time to make sure that you're, and still moving quickly, but understand what is happening within the business. Spend time with your peers in other companies. Understand, like, what are their challenges? What are their successes? Just fill out your brain with things that are beyond the more traditional ways in which you've been kind of executing the role from a process standpoint, and learn the business and learn how recruiting is one lever to drive a business forward. Learn about the other levers is maybe another way that I'd frame it. And then if that is done successfully, then I think the end point is you are someone in a room with a hiring manager where you can't necessarily tell who's in what role because you were wearing the business hat.
Okay, so the ultimate goal is for the recruiter to become the mirror image of the stakeholder they're supporting. From an outsider's perspective, they should have.
I think so.
Knowledge,
and of course, you have, like, there are trade-offs in how and where you're spending your time, and that's why I say, like, if there's like a snapshot of that conversation, that's like, oh, like, this person is thinking the way that a business leader would be. Of course, they can't be spending their time the exact same way. You also have the entire kind of recruiting ownership and leadership to drive forward as well. But I think you need to be a thought partner and a business leader, in addition to someone who is engaging and interacting and recruiting the people themselves.
Amazing, that's great. So I promise we don't take half an hour. So so I've got one more question really to wrap up. Just really is a kind of like a takeaway. So a lot of people, a lot of recruiters who've been impacted by layoffs, and they're actually in the market right now. I think we've got some really good actionable advice there on how to kind of grow and develop as a recruiter, and especially an internal recruiter in the organization. But for those that are on the market right now who are looking to stand out amongst many different job applicants, or as they're networking into different organizations that seem to be just starting to grow again, what advice would you give to help them to either develop new skills or really stand out amongst the peers?
The first advice I would give that I think is tangentially related to that is be patient and be kind to yourself. It's very easy to be hard on yourself in a job search and to try to run. And I've never heard anyone say, like, you know what, I got a mediocre job that I kind of like, but I got it really fast. So, like, that's awesome. That's perfect. That's what I wanted. I've heard plenty of people say, you know what, I took my time. I thought about what's really important to me. I thought about what my values are. And then I went and I sought that out and I found it. And it took longer and maybe even had some kind of trade-offs along the way, but I'm so much happier and more fulfilled for doing that. That would be my first piece of advice. But in how to, like, and I'm I'm also living this right now as I'm kind of searching for what I'm doing next, is I think you've got to get out there and engage and follow your curiosity and engage with people who are in the space or in related spaces who you're going to learn from. And I think if you approach it as a job, which to some degree it can be, I think it's harder to sustain that than if you approach it as an opportunity to build relationships and to learn. And that, like, even this, it's like I'm learning and enjoying like our time together. And if someone just kind of puts themselves out there and reaches out to people, not just for the like, hey, like I'm looking for a job, here's what it is, do you know anyone? But treats it as an opportunity to connect, to catch up, to hear like what's been going on in that person's life or career. I think it's going to be a way more fun and more fruitful. And I think good things will come. So it's patience and make the most of the time that you rarely have when you're immersed in a job. And just kind of keep exploring, following your curiosity, making connections with people. And just as a recruiter needs to plant a lot of seeds until the one seed germinates and becomes the successful candidate, so goes it in a job hunt. And plant a lot of seeds, plant them with intention, and they will germinate.
That's great. That's complete unplanned, but that's taken us full circle, really. So we were speaking about quality of hire. Now it's quality of job. If you're in the market, like what is the right job for you? Don't just try and find the quickest job you can, but actually make sure that you find something that's right. The way that companies are now doing it as they're hiring and building those meaningful connections and being more strategic, analytical, and thoughtful about the job search instead of just kind of transactional. I think they're all key points we've touched on that are going to be more important moving forward. And the job search is probably a perfect place to like kind of tap into that skill set. So, Joe, we've gone a little bit over, but this was a really good conversation. I really enjoyed it. I'll be sticking around to answer any questions in the comments that anyone has. But anything else you want to add, or anywhere that you want to share that people can find you, Joe?
Yeah, ping me on LinkedIn. If there is a form of social media you can find me, I will respond. Just kind of like I just mentioned, I love connecting with people. If there's any way I can ever help anyone, please reach out. If there's anything I've learned in the recruiting space, there's no such thing as too many relationships with good people. And Chris, you in my relationship is a good example of that. So anyone and everyone is welcome to ping me, and very happy to chat about anything.
Amazing. Thanks very much, Joe.